You're listening to TMI for the week of January 8th, 2018. This week, Dave talks to Australian Christina Macpherson, host of an informative webpage that keeps tabs on the nuclear industry and its attempts to get a foothold in a currently non-nuclear Australia. Christina Macpherson's website, www.antinuclear.net.
So on and off, I've been involved in various anti-uranium mining, anti-nuclear causes and movements in Australia.
I was talking to somebody here who lives in a region in Ontario that has two very large nuclear plants, and she, as a kid, was alarmed by the distribution of the KI pills, and she got a bunch of her little girlfriends together and they went around and canvassed the neighborhood, and so it's often the kids that catch wind of this and take interest on their own.
Yes, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I find it interesting because this may be a bit of a sort of off the track, but my little symbol, which nobody seems to understand, it says a cat can look at a king. To me, that means that you don't need a whole heap of university academic training to have an opinion, that a very, very simple people can have an opinion that is valid.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's important in Australia because we're a bit of a cultural cringe place that if you're not a nuclear physicist, well, you can't possibly know anything about nuclear power, whether it's good or bad. And I'm very keen for people to realise that anybody can look at the issues and form an opinion.
Right, and it's not just the actual physics of it. There's ethics, geopolitics, economics, proliferation, military strategy, security. I mean, so there's so many disciplines that should have a voice when debating the subject, and I agree, it's almost like a priesthood.
Yes, and issues like social justice, ecology, all those issues that you mentioned, they're all part of forming an opinion about things like nuclear power.
Yeah. So you run a website. It's antinuclear.net.
Yes, that's all about Australia, that one.
Well, that's okay. I mean, actually, you are a test ground for this issue. Here's a country that has no nuclear reactors, exports uranium, and I understand there's a great debate in Australia about whether or not to, pull the plug and get reactors running there.
Well, you're not actually right in saying there's a great debate. Whether it's our sunshine or whether it's our media run by Rupert Murdoch, Australians are really quite unaware. By and large, they're unaware of the issue. And it's just a quiet, continuous effort that's been going on for decades by certain business people and politicians to get the nuclear fuel chain happening in this country. I wouldn't call it a great debate because apart from enthusiastic activists like myself, the rest of Australia is practically oblivious of it.
So I'm shocked to hear that because you guys had a royal commission. I would have assumed that would have attracted a lot of public attention.
No, well, that was a very strange royal commission. First of all, it was it was a South Australian government thing, and it was managed somehow or other to be kept practically secret from the rest of Australia, treated as though it was just an issue for South Australia. It was different from any other royal commission we've ever had. For one thing, the chief commissioner was a military man. Now, nearly always, all royal commissions here have someone like a judge or retired judge, someone with legal knowledge as the commissioner, not a military person. The people on the advisory panel were almost entirely nuclear advocates, and the whole examination, particularly in certain areas like radiation hazards was done from a pro-nuclear point of view. It was a really crummy Royal Commission coming out with the conclusion, which they'd already decided upon before they started, that it'd be great for South Australia to import the world's nuclear wastes. That was the conclusion they came to.
Wow. We had a Royal Commission in 1978, the Porter Commission. I guess luckily, one of its conclusions was that no new nuclear reactors should be built until there's some kind of solution to the nuclear waste. On one hand, that's kind of a failure if that's the primary conclusion, because it didn't address we have 20 nuclear reactors in this single province. So it didn't put a halt to it, but at least it did put a halt to new builds. Obviously, there was never any solution to nuclear waste, but they haven't built any new nuclear reactors here.
That was an interesting Royal Commission. I think ours was just simply a deceptive thing. It wasn't a fair-minded or impartial Royal Commission. They knew what they wanted to do.
Did they have public input?
Well, this is where things started to go wrong for them. The Premier of South Australia decided to set up things like citizens' juries and committees consulting, and they did invite the public, and these bodies came out with a resounding no, we shouldn't do it. And amongst this, and many economists pointed out that it wasn't going to be a financial benefit to the state, and particularly the Aborigines came to the rescue, as they always do in this country, and they totally opposed it. And Aborigines in Australia have got a strong history of opposing the nuclear industry, starting out with South Australia, because they suffered the effects of many, many atom bombs tested in South Australia on Aboriginal land. And they were many, I don't know how many died or how many got sick, but they were mostly evacuated. But they had to be moved off their lands and live somewhere else. And some of them suffer ill effects from the bombing because they still went to areas of radiation. And those Aborigines, many of them are still living, still fighting against anything nuclear. So they've been a strong force in South Australia against that Royal Commission.
There seems to be two approaches. One is to be, as you would hope, protectors of the waterways, which often these plants affect, also the mining. But I also am aware that the companies, the mining corporations, and probably local counties that are taking host money, they throw that money around. And so they're often buying off the locals to get support for whatever plans they have.
Well, that's exactly what's happening in South Australia too. The government is making big attempts, the federal government, to buy them off. Just by the way, some of our Aborigines from South Australia are probably going to Canada for the time of the annual general meeting of the Camecco company.
Wow.
They're going to join in activist movements against uranium mining, because Camecco, I think they have one uranium mine in Australia, and they're trying to set up two in Western Australia, but they're meeting with a lot of opposition, and the Aborigines are taking out a legal case against Camecco in Western Australia.
The market hasn't been doing that great for uranium. Why are they still digging for it?
Well, I think you said earlier some phrase like it was almost I don't know whether you would call it a religious zeal, but a sort of, I can't think of
a priesthood, I called it, and it's...
Yes, you called it a priesthood.
Yeah.
I think the nuclear priesthood, this is my own idea, I've got no evidence for it. I think when they dropped the bombs back in 1945, I think there was a sort of guilty feeling amongst nuclear scientists, and then they decided they would do atoms for peace and turn a bad thing into a good thing. And I think that idea is still around, that nuclear will be great, it will save the world, tum-ta-da. And so when we can get it all happening, and when we can get nuclear reactors stopping climate change and doing all these wonderful things, then the uranium market will pick up. So we'll all hang on in there, because it'll pick up one of these days. But it doesn't seem to ever pick up.
Yeah, I also call them the unelected ruling class, because people, even at dinner table conversations, defer, as you mentioned, answers in terms of, should we or shouldn't we, always to these white-cloaked, receding hairlined nuclear priests. And they're essentially, we have, put them on a pedestal. And they are, in a sense, a ruling class. If you send one off to a politician's office, chances are he'll convince them, despite the fact...
They will.
Yeah.
I think they will. But they're not all white-haired, receding males at all. There's a lot of very young, cool, trendy people, trendy females that are involved in the new nuclear movement. Mm-hmm. And this is strongly pushed by a few people in Australia. Most notable is a guy called Ben Hurd. Mm-hmm. He's a very smart guy. And these are companies like Terrestrial Energy, Transatomic. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of other ones like NewScale over in Britain, and those companies are pushing the Generation 4 nuclear reactors, which of course have never been tried and nobody knows what they'll be like. But they're pushing those in the small modular reactors. They leave out the word nuclear. And they were a lot behind that whole business of that Royal Commission. They sent submissions into the Royal Commission and promoted the idea that if Australia became a hub for nuclear wastes, then two things would happen that would be good for them. First of all, Asian countries could set up new reactors in the knowledge that they could send the wastes to Australia, so that would solve the waste problem. And the other thing was that they could organise it to set up nuclear reactors in Australia, particularly, these small modular nuclear reactors and the thorium ones, which I think we mentioned previously. And so for thorium, you really have to have plutonium or enriched uranium to start the reaction. So you've got to import those things, your plutonium and your rich uranium. So really, to get the new nuclear happening in Australia, you have to have nuclear wastes coming in for a start. It's all very connected.
Well, yes. So I wanted to get to thorium, so we may as well now. So I know that you deal with the thoriumists, as we call them. I personally cut my teeth fighting thoriumists for at least 2 years on social media. They're quite an interesting crew of people. It's the same people. Now, 7 years later, same faces, same rhetoric. And so just for listeners, thorium. So as Christina mentions, thorium isn't fissile, it is fertile.
That's right.
Which means you need to start the reaction with the conventional fuel. So I've often described it as a starter kit for crackpot dictators who want to actually acquire the base materials.
I hadn't thought of it that way.
For nuclear weapons, because the main argument behind thorium is its proliferation resistance. And yet, if you were some little country who was going to start using thorium in a reactor, your first shipment would be the very thing that you're trying to limit the trading in, which is the enriched uranium and plutonium. And of course, these things generate tritium, which is another part of a nuclear weapons toolkit. And so thorium, it's not fissile, it's fertile. And what happens is they start the reactor with a conventional fuel. they load in thorium-232. After a time, that degrades to protactinium-232, and 23 days later, that degrades to uranium-233, which is what they actually burn in the reactor, and you wind up with a lot of the same nuclear waste that you would wind up with in any reactor. So their claims of it being a solution to nuclear waste is just another nuclear fallacy.
Yes, and they use this claim also to claim that, now this mightn't be the thorium reactors, this might be some of the other 6 or 7 or more new designs,
right,
that they claim that they eat the waste.
Okay.
But from what I've read, they may produce a smaller volume of waste, but it's so highly toxic that it requires the same area to dispose of it safely as if it were larger, the original waste. So
Right.
they don't solve the waste problem at all.
Well, if you look at the contents of a tube of spent nuclear fuel, there's only a very small percentage of it that is fissile. So you can't. So those other chemicals, I mean, in spent nuclear fuel, there's 211 radioactive isotopes. So there's thousands of other chemicals that wind up in these fuel rods, and only a very tiny percentage of a fuel rod could ever be burned in any kind of nuclear reactor. So it is lie after lie after lie.
Yeah. Well, here in Australia, we've got another thing happening in relation to spent fuel rods. We don't have a nuclear industry, but we do have one nuclear reactor, which is a research reactor in Sydney, and the spent rods from that reactor are sent to England or Britain, Scotland really, and to France, and where they get processed and under a contract that means that after a certain time they have to come back to Australia. And I think some went to America, but mostly Scotland and France. So when they come back, which is now starting to happen, they are stored in Sydney at Lucas Heights near the reactor. But the federal government is now planning, well, they've been planning this for years, what they call a national radioactive waste dump. They first wanted to put that up in the Northern Territory, but they didn't count on the Aborigines up there who fought like crazy and were able to stop them. So they're now trying to do it in South Australia, where they would be sending these wastes right across the continent, like a couple of thousand miles, and put them in the country area in South Australia. But the hypocrisy of this is that the government is claiming that they're medical wastes and they're low-level wastes, even though I've looked at some reports from France. The wastes that they're sending back are classified as high-level in France.
Yeah.
And suddenly they get to Australia and the federal government decides that they're, well, perhaps intermediate level. And then they tell the people in South Australia that they're low-level. So, and this is all promoted with the idea that the whole purpose of the nuclear reactor is medical, to produce medical isotopes. So they're able to turn it into a sort of plus, like this wonderful reactor, it benefits the world with medical isotopes and you can help us by storing the medical wastes. Part of the craziness of this is that nearly all medical wastes have broken down, their half-life is gone within a few hours or a couple of days. They couldn't get the wastes across to South Australia. You know, by the time they got there, they wouldn't be any longer radioactive, very few. So there's absolutely no need to set up a waste dump 2,000 miles away for medical waste.
So the isotopes they're extracting are short-lived.
They're very short-lived, and if you think about medical things, it really makes sense not to make those medical isotopes in a nuclear reactor.
Yeah.
The sensible way to do it, and it's being done in many places in the world, is to make them in a cyclotron, particle accelerator, right near where they're going to be used in the hospital. Makes complete sense, because if they're very short-lived, you've got the problem of quickly transporting them to the hospital to be used while they're still radioactive. So there's no need now for a nuclear reactor. Even the most difficult one, technetium-99 I think it is, is now being able to be made in a cyclotron. So it used to not be able to be made, but it can now. So there's really no need for a nuclear reactor. But it's a kind of a fig leaf on the industry.
One thing I've noticed is countries, they have public hearings or hearings, and some of them are public. And, some people speculate this is just a theater in which to generate or manufacture consent and at least claim that the public was consulted. If you guys are going to start importing nuclear waste, I assume there would be public hearings held. And would they generate much public interest?
Well, in South Australia, as I said before, they managed to somehow or other, and I do think the Australian media conspires in this, to make it be just an issue for South Australia, which is completely silly, because we have national laws prohibiting the nuclear industry, definitely prohibiting importing wastes, so it's definitely a national matter. But they managed to make it be just a South Australian matter. And I think what they didn't bank on, they had these little citizens' jury meetings and a few consultative meetings, and I just think they underestimated the people who went along to these meetings. They didn't, when they did their homework, they didn't like the idea. So although they didn't have big public hearings, they had enough hearings and enough in South Australia to make the people turn against it. And the government had to do a complete about-face and say no.
Oh, well, that's good. Here in Ontario, so of course we're just hell-bent on self-destruction here. We are trying to bury our nuclear waste right beside a great lake. And they held hearings, and so one note would be that originally they would have been scheduled for a couple days, and by the time the public chimed in and filed their written submissions beforehand, they realized they had to expand them to 2 weeks. And what I found, I covered them pretty consistently, was that, these are in rural areas surrounded by farmland. And so us cosmopolitan urbanites might form an idea of what that might mean in terms of the kinds of people showing up. And yes, there were farmers showing up to these hearings. But these days, farmers have degrees. They're not messing around. These people showed up well-informed, data in hand, and made stunning presentations. And of course, it's still up in the air. I think the relevant minister has been prolonging making a final decision for quite some time. But I could not believe what great presenters there were. And I mean the locals, not people who came from afar to present at the hearings. So you never know what opposition will drum up at these hearings.
Yes, that's a thought. And I understand that, there was opposition from USA people and USA politicians. After all, it's pretty close to the border, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know if you remember the story, but there was a senator and a congressperson, I believe, from Ohio. And one of the controversies at the time of those hearings was that presenters were being harassed by our Ontario Provincial Police. The OPP was going around knocking on doors and pre-interviewing people who had signed up to present at these hearings, and even went to Ohio and tried to contact the senator and congressman, I guess to, read them the riot act on if there was going to be demonstrations. But in a way, here's provincially owned reactors, using sort of what appeared to be the provincial police to go and harass people who are going to present at hearings, even sitting senators and congressmen in the United States. So, this is big, really important to somebody here in Ontario.
Yes, I hadn't heard about that. That's extraordinary.
It is. I'll send you the links, and maybe I'll put them in the show notes. It was in the newspapers.
The thing that gets me about all this is that I see a lot of opposition to waste dumping. I read stuff, all over the world. People are opposing it, and I can certainly see why you don't want it near the Great Lakes. But I don't see enough people saying, "Hey, let's stop making it."
Oh yeah. Well, that's
And that amazes me. I know a few people say that, but it seems to me that would be step one.
Well, my theory is that, these people with their PhDs in nuclear physics lose the ability for simple rationalization. Like, if there's no solution to the nuclear waste, to stop making it. I mean, I think that's too simple for them.
Yes, that's why I have a cat can look at a king.
Mm-hmm.
I actually myself do have 2 degrees, but I never actually make a point of that, because I know that if you're debating with a nuclear proponent, you will never have enough degrees
or the right ones.
Philosophy. You will always come out looking quite uneducated compared to them.
Yeah.
So this is one of the strengths of the Aborigines, by the way. They don't even bother with all that stuff.
Right.
They just say, we don't want it.
Yeah. It's similar to the kids alerting, and even yourself, alerting to the basic logic of it from an early age, the simplicity of the rationalization of it. If it makes bombs, it's bad. If bombs are bad. There's no solution to the waste. If it's too expensive, if the locals don't want it. All these ifs, and they're very simple. But,
yes, they are simple.
Yeah.
I think too expensive is a very interesting one, actually, because that's what I think that one in South Australia very strongly, despite the strong fight of the Aborigines. I really think the economists came out with, hey, too expensive. But the things about South Australia that are pretty appalling, the Aborigines have got a pretty strong argument that they don't want their sacred sites damaged, they don't want their water supply damaged, their fertile land damaged. But as well as the Aborigines, we do have agriculture is pretty big, and South Australian agriculture is pretty big. And this is the thing, where do we sell it all to? Mostly to China. And from everything I can read, Chinese people are becoming more and more enthusiastic about having clean produce, clean milk, clean vegetables, clean fruit. And I think that, and I don't think I'm the only one that thinks this, if the Chinese got wind that there was a radioactive waste dump near where they're importing their food from, I don't think they'd stop buying it. I think it's just terribly bad for the economy to change the clean green image of South Australia for a radioactive waste dump image.
Well, all the California grape fields are all downwind from, San Onofre and Diablo Canyon and whatever else they're doing, the military out there. Here in Ontario, we're all pushing, Ontario produce. I can't remember the slogan. And these orchards and farmlands, some of the richest farmlands in Canada, are surrounded in every direction by either a mine, a processing plant, or a nuclear power plant, some of which that actually burn nuclear waste in incinerators, believe it or not. And then you've got France denying that they were affected by the plume from Chernobyl, and we know how proud they are of their cheese and their wine. And
yes, France has got a bit of an excuse because they started it off a long time ago before we knew how bad it was.
Mm-hmm.
But the modern, especially for Australia, idea, we now know how bad it is, so don't let's start it. As just in relation to China, any nuclear proponents would laugh at what I said about China. Would say it's ridiculous. It's only a tiny area. It won't have any effect on the agriculture. And they could be right. But from the point of view of the Chinese, it just doesn't look good.
There's a stigma.
And that's really, it's not so much the reality as the perception.
Yeah.
In marketing something, if the perception is that it's coming from a dirty radioactive place, kills the market. Sort of an area that the nuclear proponents don't understand at all.
Well, I think it's part of the indigenous argument as well. It's also how it feels to have this land that you care so deeply about. Just the idea of it being polluted, whether actually or just the idea of it's almost it's like, I can't think of a term for it, but it spiritually pollutes the land.
Yes, that's right. Interesting that you mention that, because I'm not talking about religion much here, but I'm interested that I've been doing that website nuclearnews.net for 10 years, and over the years the most popular items have been about ethics. That's the ones that people have been reading most.
Right.
So it just shows people are interested in the real meaning of things.
So you touched on large corporations trying to fast-track women to change the palatability of nuclear for younger people, and probably not changing the percentage of their workforce much, but putting women often at the head and in their promotional photographs and trying to sell it to women, when actually women are more vulnerable to radiation.
Well, that's why they want to try and get women on side.
Yeah.
There's even a group called Mums for Nuclear or something like that.
For nuclear.
Which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
But just you mentioned large corporations. I don't think they are large corporations. I think they're quite small relative. When you think of large corporations, you think of General Electric, Areva, Westinghouse. You think of those big ones, Toshiba, lots of them. But the new ones are these little things like, well, maybe new scales, a bit bigger, transatomic terrestrial energy. There's and Bill Gates' thing, TerraPower. These are small groups funded largely by a few billionaires, I'd say, like Bill Gates, and they think of bringing a whole new image into the nuclear thing. They're not like the old nuclear. They're small nuclear reactors. They're sort of cool and hip, and I think they do promote women as much as they possibly can in their area. And I think they're even, to a degree, opposed to the old nuclear. They say, we're the new wave. We're not like the dirty old nuclear. But in another sense, they'll support the old nuclear and say, look, we're going to help you because our reactors will eat up your wastes. So they're really giving out a double message there. But they are pushing this kind of new, young, trendy, female-friendly image. That's where you get people like Ben Hurd of Australia and Michael Schellenberger from USA.
A couple of those companies, Transatomic, I think there's some Canadian investment in one of those companies. What was it, Transatomic, and what was the other one?
Terrestrial Energy.
One of those is a Canadian company, I think.
Yes, could be. There's a lot of them. There's about 7 or 8. I just can't think of the other names at the moment. I can think of NuScale, but I suspect that's more in England.
And these are the small modular reactors. I often post an article by Arjun Makhijani from IEER. I'll put it in the show notes. His primary argument is, and this is against the small modular, but they're the light water SMRs. And the basic argument is they lack economy of scale.
Yes, I think that's very clear, because to sell them, you'd have to market them. Well, they tried very hard. They want to sell them to Australia. There's quite a push going on to try to get this happening in Australia. Of course, the first step is to change the laws here that forbid them. But when you think about marketing them to Australia, to the government, of course, because nobody else is willing to take the risk, they'd have to order a whole heap of them, not just 1 or 2, but a whole lot. And then what if you buy the whole lot and it isn't satisfactory? It's a terrible waste of money. So I think they're sort of caught in that trap that they've got to market them en masse.
Yeah, you're suggesting that if you order a lot of them, you might undo some of the lack of economy of scale. But
yes, I think, well, if they could market a whole heap of them, probably that might be economic for the company.
For the company, but in terms of overcoming the lack of economy of scale, I argue that there's a lot of duplication. If you have small modular reactors, you still need a giant land footprint. You still destroy that site forever. You still need to pave a giant parking lot and house all of the support buildings and other infrastructure. So it not only is there a lack of scale in terms of the amount of electricity produced per plant, but there's a lot of duplication. And when actually a primary argument against these giant reactors that we have, apparently they lack economy of scale because none of them actually generate any benefit to the public financially and only generate long-term liability, hidden costs, and costs that are included in the cost of the electricity they provide.
Yeah. Well, it has been a lie from the very beginning.
Right.
When they said it was economic, well, it's economic if you don't count the social costs, the health costs, starting from uranium mining, the waste disposal costs, the security of the waste forever. I mean, if you just look at the reactor itself and don't count any of the other costs, it looks economic. But even that doesn't look economic in America now, does it?
No. Here's another thing that always struck me from the thoriumists' designs for thorium reactors and the SMRs. What this really is a workaround. They want to locate these small reactors not way off hundreds of miles away from cities. They will be on Main Street. One of the arguments was that you don't have to now run giant power towers, generating lines, and all kinds of copper between the remote location and the city that it would power. You locate them closer to the city, and here's the punchline. If you look at all of these designs, the one thing that's different between SMRs and large-scale nuclear reactors is a containment. There is no containment for these SMRs.
They do argue that there'll be a thick concrete containment over them to prevent terrorism attacks and stuff like that. Yeah. Don't they?
I don't know. I've seen so many designs of them, and every time you come up with a reactor design flaw, they show you another JPEG of another reactor design. I've been up and down the street with them over and over. So every time you come up with a design flaw, they come up with another reactor design. So it's a game of whack-a-mole.
I'm thinking about the containment thing for all these little reactors and thinking how much cheaper it would be if you made the containment a bit thinner. And
save money.
I mean, if you think about the argument for safety is very counter to the argument for economics.
Of course.
And there are all sorts of safety questions. Like they say, well, we'll put them underground. That'll be safer from terrorist attacks. And then you think, well, what if there was flooding?
Flood. Yeah, and fires.
Or what if something goes wrong underground? How do people get down and help to get the people out, or so on?
Absolutely. And fires.
But your argument about putting them near cities is not the way it's pitched in Australia. The nuclear lobby is now pitching to country areas. Not a word about it in the cities, but in the country areas, yes. And they're pitching. We have a wonderful politician called Corey Bernardi. He's sort of, I don't know whether he's like Ted Cruz or someone. I can't think who he's like, but he's to the extreme right wing. But Corey Bernardi's wanting little small nuclear reactors in country areas because you could see the advantage because they don't have to have great long mounts of wires coming from far away places. They can just power the local area. And it sort of sounds good, and the argument seems to be that the government could buy a whole heap of these and distribute them around in different country areas. I think it's a crackpot idea.
Well, you will have nuclear waste trucks on the roads like they were municipal garbage trucks.
You would, yes, but I doubt very much that this idea is being pushed in remote and country towns, but it's not being mentioned in the city. But I think it is so crackpot that I doubt that even the country areas would accept it. And of course, the other mad thing that's happening alongside that they never mention is the small solar plants and wind-generated plants that are popping up all over the place in the country and providing energy with free fuel.
And everyone's proud of them and feels good about them.
That's a very good point that you make there, Dave. Yes, that there are little community cooperatives running them, and they feel very pleased with themselves and very happy about it.
Yeah. Versus like in California, where you're walking down the beach and suddenly there's this, monument to failure, right? With the giant domes
that's what it is.
And it's an embarrassment.
Whopping great sarcophagus.
Yeah.
Yes. You touched on some very interesting areas here of just people's feelings and how they look upon things, and even spirituality, what makes them feel good.
Well, I've noticed that, in some of these hearings, there are presentations from the Indigenous, and they're very moving. And
yes, they are.
They're not wordy and complicated, like you said, and there's a real, and you really get the sense for their idea of being connected to the land, that they're the custodians of the land. They were here first. It's built into their spirituality. And if we don't care about it, somebody has to. It's a noble role for the Indigenous people to play. I've always thought that was a missed opportunity, that they really do and should have more of a role in our politics as that's their job, is to worry about.
I think it's starting to happen.
Yeah.
I have to mention, because a lot of us are very proud of the ICAN people, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, winning the Nobel Peace Prize.
Right.
And, of course, that started in Australia, and those guys worked for 10 years. Well, now we find Aborigines on board with this too, and early this year, in about January the 6th, I think it is, the Peace Boat will be coming to Western Australia. That's coming from Japan. That's a Japanese initiative of the Hiroshima survivors. Some of them will be on the boat, and they've been doing this for years, but they're doing a tour of Australia, and that will include, they're coming first to Western Australia and then travelling to other capital cities around the coast, and that will include some Australian Aborigines and some of the people who worked to get that treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons through. And this is something to be pretty proud of, because our Australian Aborigines are part of that too. I have to mention that one because it's good.
Please. And, another thing that bothers me is that, and I think this is true with Australia, but in Canada, our government and our peoples, are pretty proud of their claims of being non-nuclear, weapons-wise, and yet in Canada, we have done nothing but supply all the nations who've pursued nuclear weapons. And a lot of that technology and the underpinnings for it are right here in Ontario historically. And then in the case of Australia, another large uranium exporter, these, proud claims of anti-nuclear, and yet, there's a responsibility for Fukushima. In the case of Australia.
That's exactly the same story in Australia. Our politicians, both sides of politics, have been really weak on this, but Liberal the worst, Conservatives the worst, but Labor not too good. One particular politician, he's not a politician now, but he's still very active, Gareth Evans. He's always been put up as a sort of hero against nuclear weapons because he's done a lot of work on nuclear disarmament or ban treaties and so on, but he's pushed for the nuclear industry at the same time. So he's managed to promote Australia's uranium industry while sort of rather gloriously getting the credit for being anti-nuclear weapons. He's pushed the idea that the two things are separate, which is a lie.
Another lie.
Just going back to Aborigines, they went over to Scotland. See, you were saying earlier that the farmers have got degrees and, they're very literate and articulate.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to point out that even our tough, strong Aborigines, some of them are very like that too. Yeah. And some went to Scotland and are now appealing to the Scottish government they want the government to stop the sending of nuclear wastes back to Australia until Australia has got somewhere to permanently put these wastes.
Right.
That's pretty important because the waste dump that is proposed for South Australia, which is 2,000 miles away from where the wastes are produced, is above ground. It's like San Onofre, I think. It's canisters sitting above ground, made by a Holtec company, and they're supposed to last for 300 years or something. And then what?
Right.
They mightn't even last 300 years. I don't know how long they're meant to last.
The UK also has a nuclear waste repository debate near some lakes. I don't know what this industry has for putting both the plants and the waste beside famous lakes, but is it the Lakes District? Again, I should know.
It's the Lakes District. It's Cumbria.
Yeah.
And it's a very beautiful,
right.
I've never been there, but I've just looked at pictures. Yeah. Beautiful place for agriculture and tourism, and it's just lovely. And they're trying to develop both there and meeting with quite strong opposition from local people.
I've always wondered if these nuclear, I don't know what to call them, the nuclear employed, hate nature. And I know they must say, anybody who cares about a lake or a fish, we're all tree huggers. And there's this cynical, stoic approach to the dangers and the environmental costs, I guess, that come with a lot of large corporations and the thing called the G. But I always just feel like they hate a nice view. A good view down the beach, a beautiful lake, or like the indigenous, like, one of the things that really upset me when I was younger, because, I wound up going to some nuclear protests when I was a kid. So this has been sort of part of my existence. But the feeling that you can't really love Ontario, the more you know about it. And that's it doesn't feel good, even if, just for an urbanite like myself, it's not being able to be proud. It affects your nationalism. It affects your sense of pride. It affects a lot of things. So, one thing I want to ask you, so activism, it's not for everybody. I would describe it often as swinging back and forth between a feeling of hopelessness. These giant corporations, they've already done the stuff that you're fighting. And the pendulum might swing to the extreme opposite, where you expect everything in your world to make sense and be rationalized and smart decisions be made. You have righteous indignation at all of it. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, some days it feels like a hopeless battle, and other days things that make sense are things we need to move forward with.
Look, we just have to do it. We had a popular band about 20 years back in Australia called Red Gum. And I think they had a song. They certainly had an album cover, and it was simply called "If You Don't Fight, You Lose."
Huh.
And that, to me, is what it's all about. If you don't fight, you lose. Yeah. I mean, you might lose anyway, but you're certainly not going to win if you don't fight.
It reminds me of the slogan, "You can't win if you don't buy a ticket." It's the opposite. It doesn't make any sense.
And the other thing, now, I don't know, I mean, I've got children and grandchildren, I would like them to know that somebody tried.
Mm-hmm. Hearings that I assume will go on when you start talking about the waste dump for the world in South Australia. The thing I'll be waiting to hear are lines like citing other attempts at geological storage or repositories as IAEA endorsed best practices. And then you turn to the next page and look at all the leaks, failures, fires, collapses, and stuff of all these previously cited examples of best practices. And that's what they said at the hearings when they were talking a few years ago about the waste storage here in Ontario. They cited the WIP as an example of a world-class execution of a great plan.
Yes.
And then just a few months later, of course, collapses and fires and
it's still got tunnels that are likely to collapse, and it's still problematic. But I mean, the idea of transporting wastes for long distances past, imagine flying them, imagine ships, rail, road, whatever it is, puts everybody in danger along the way.
Right. And so, it exports the liability. I mean, chances are that the region that agreed to have the plant in it, maybe they're the ones who should be punished with the nuclear waste. Why then ship it across the great distance to some area that at one time didn't want anything to do with it and inflict the... It's kind of like when they're doing that in Japan, they're shipping some of the nuclear waste all over Japan to areas that the debris weren't generated in.
Well, they've really got very few places to put it. I don't know what their solution is. But I do think that the deep burial of waste is the currently least worst solution. So combining that with shutting down the industry would be the way to go.
Right.
There's another aspect that Australia gets enthusiastic about, and this could be a bit off the point, but I'm going to say the great enthusiasm recently about space travel, trip going to Mars and the rest of it, and we've set up some new space agency in Australia. And nobody mentions the fact that the fuel on these spaceships is plutonium.
Yeah.
And that there have been accidents and crashes with spaceships.
Yeah.
And maybe there'll be more. And it doesn't sound like a very good idea at all.
I don't know how the statistics have changed, but a long time ago, one of my often repeated tweets was that NASA itself had a statistic of a 1 in 220 chance of failure on launch. So these
but they
missions...
reduced that down to a smaller number. And I can't remember what it was, but it was something like 1 in 72.
Wow.
So,
but even at 210, when your payload contains nuggets of plutonium, that's a big risk for the people downwind. Not to mention the what they do with the crafts. I mean, in the case of Mars, they're just going to leave those machines and stuff where they are, or crash them somewhere, and so
that's right.
You're just taking this love they have for spreading around their nuclear waste. It's just
what annoys me about this is that it's always taxpayer funded.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, our body in Australia called Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, which is a big pusher for the industry in Australia, and they're pushing this setting up of this waste dump in South Australia. Very, very secretive and heavily funded by government, but nobody knows how much money they get. And it's a bit the same with the space thing. I think that if the public realised that it's the money that is not going into hospitals and schools and welfare that is needed in environment programs and agriculture, it's not going into those areas. It's going into this polluting industry.
Right.
And it would be lovely if the public made a bit of a fuss about that and said, look, not my money, thanks.
That's sort of another thing that reminds me of North Korea. They're pursuing this very expensive endeavor at the cost of their people, and the same could be said. I mean, another image that I saw that really shocked me was a photo of a city in India, and it was about their electrical infrastructure, and of course the view down Main Street of this city in India just has a spider's web of wires just like all over the place in every conceivable direction. I'll look for my old tweet of that. If anybody looks at it, they'll be amazed. It's as if it was extension cords just all in random, a literal fur ball of wires in a street. And yet they've been pursuing nuclear reactors since the 50s and have spent no effort on other things, like they're even making a weatherproof distribution system, or a safe distribution system at that. So misallocated priorities, allocating public money for the pursuit of this apple pie in the sky technology.
Yeah. So I just, the other thing, my latest hobby horse is just about the media. I think the media have got to do a better job. But I think the internet has thrown a spanner in the works in that so many journalists have lost their jobs.
Right.
So few investigative journalists are left.
Right.
And it's so much easier to just cover sports and celebrity scandals.
Let me ask you this. Does the nuclear industry in Australia place ads in the news media?
No, they don't worry, because the whole thing in Australia is to never mention the word. Just let the government, let ANSTO, Australian Nuclear and Science and Technology Organisation, let them just go ahead quietly promoting this federal waste dump in South Australia, and a few people just promoting the Defence Department would love to have nuclear submarines. They bought some submarines for $50 billion from France. They could have got cheaper ones from Germany, but the good thing about the French ones is that the design is for nuclear submarines. So they're actually going to be diesel-fueled ones, but very easy to transform them to nuclear. So there's sort of a whole little push from defence people, some nuclear industry people, some politicians, and ANSTO, and they just quietly go along behind the scenes. No publicity. $50 billion of public money. So all these things are not, they don't need advertisements in the paper, just proceed quietly with them.
Find us on Twitter @thatarcher, our podcast page tmi.twxnet.com. Please rate the show on iTunes. Full-page advertisements from the Canadian Nuclear Association and all the usual suspects. So they advertise right in the media. And the fact of the matter is that in Ontario, with 20 nuclear reactors, if you asked anybody in Ontario how many nuclear reactors are in Ontario, they would say 2 or 3. So
did you say there's 20?
20.
Good heavens, I had no idea.
Well, there's 3 large plants. There's Bruce, and it has 8 reactors. And there's Pickering, and it has 8 reactors. And there's Darlington, and it has 4 giant reactors. And then there's Chalk River, which is a bunch of the medical-related and experimental reactors. So it adds up to 20. And it's the bulk of our generation capacity in Ontario. It has been since, the end of the 60s, essentially. And no one knows anything about nuclear in Ontario, and I mean no one. And that is by design.
They don't criticize it. People don't criticize it.
They have no idea anything about it. I suggest that by advertising in news media, who's, as you mentioned, struggling for its very existence, this keeps the stories absent or very soft on nuclear.
Yes, I see.
And as a kid, our schools often, or used to in the 70s, take kids to nuclear power plants for tours. And then you find out later that the teachers' union is heavily invested in the nuclear industry. So, it's diabolical. Between that and host payments and it's a kind of an iron curtain in a way.
Well, it's unfortunately set in so strongly in Canada. So we're kind of lucky in Australia that the nuclear industry's never had a real foothold here, except for uranium mining. But in this country, we have very strong laws, both states and federal, that absolutely prohibit any building of nuclear reactors, any uranium enrichment, any reprocessing, any waste dump, except for that one little government one. The laws in this country prohibit that, so the goal of the nuclear industry here, and they're very persistent, they just go on for decades, is to get rid of those laws. And so they will eventually have to try and get some public support to overturn those laws, because they can't really do anything until they've overturned those laws. So,
well, the interesting thing about Canada is that, we have about 12 provinces. There's only one other reactor in Canada, in New Brunswick. So every other province, there's no nuclear reactors. It's just Ontario.
Only Ontario.
So Ontario is this experiment, and an experiment that started at the end of the 60s. And it's not like you're seeing them cropping up elsewhere in the country. So I say it is a failed experiment.
How would they cope with switching their power supply now? I mean, it's very cold there, etc. How would they quickly switch? Well, they couldn't quickly, but how could they switch away from nuclear?
Yeah. Well, we're right next to Quebec, and Quebec has had a surplus of hydropower for a very, very long time. They give it away to the United States. There's I'm trying to find the words to describe it, but there's a definite resistance to it's a lot of forms of trade between Ontario and Quebec. And there's a push on, one of our guests from Ontario Clean Air Alliance a few episodes ago was pointing out our premier has currently made some agreements to buy some of that power from Quebec. And so there's this giant surplus of very cheap power we could very easily import from Quebec. Furthermore, before Ontario pursued nuclear power, we were entirely hydro, hence the former Ontario Hydro.
Sake.
It's called Ontario Hydro for
that
a
is
reason.
So crazy.
Well, it turned out the Premier, Bill Davis, at the time had some friends in the uranium mining business, and you can make the rest up as you see fit. So we were entirely clean, green, and renewable. We could return to that. There are these Great Lakes, and so not only are there wind opportunities, but there's offshore wind, and these are giant seas of lakes. They're huge lakes. There's no reason why, even out of sight, these spaces could be used for wind. There's high areas of land. There's, even if you argue remote areas of Ontario, it's highlands, very windy. We do have sun, and so Ontario had programs like FIT and MicroFIT, where we were subsidizing people to pursue renewables, wind and solar, and people were biting at that like it was candy, because again, people want to feel good about these decisions that they make for power. So I mean, there's all kinds of options.
Yes, there are. It just requires some cooperation between Ontario and the other state, and people willing to do it. Could be done, couldn't it?
Yeah. It can be done pretty much anywhere, I think. It's so ironic,
yeah.
like Saudi Arabia wanting to pursue nuclear electricity. When
that is a joke.
Really. I mean, you don't even have to, really. So, and it's true mostly anywhere. There's also examples where wind can back up solar and solar can back up wind. There's, didn't you guys just have a giant battery built in Australia?
We did, yes.
Yeah.
There was a whole big fuss about that. Now, I've sort of stopped following that because there's so much going on in the nuclear, but it's huge in South Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And the battery is a great success.
Mm-hmm.
And renewable energy is racing ahead in that state.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, right across Australia, solar power is going ahead. I think we definitely do have per head of population, we have the largest amount of household solar power, people putting up panels on their roofs, and lots of business community power. And the government has sort of tried to put the brakes on the solar industry as much as they could, because we have a very odd government at the moment, with a Prime Minister who's desperately trying to hang on to his job by placating the fossil fuel and nuclear industries. He would just do anything to hang on to his job. He's got no ideas of his own. But despite the government, solar power and wind power is going ahead fast in Australia, and something to be proud of.
I was stumbling over my own thoughts at the beginning of our conversation. The thing I forgot to point out was, and I wanted to ask if it was the same thing in Australia, the problem in Canada is the three main parties, which is what I was trying to get at with the per vote subsidy and all that. They're all pro-nuclear. So it doesn't matter who wins. Furthermore, there's never been an election where nuclear was part of anyone's election platform. In fact, I've called candidates and asked what's their party's position on nuclear, and I couldn't believe the answers I was getting. It was, we'll reveal those policies after the election. So it's
we'll tell you later.
I couldn't believe it. And so in Australia, it sounds the same. The three main parties.
No, well, it's not like that so much here.
No?
Traditionally, the Liberal Party, which is our Conservative Party, has always been pro-nuclear and still is. And it has a little extreme section, which is very pro-nuclear. We used to have Prime Minister Abbott, but people hated him so much he went. But he's still in Parliament, and his little faction is very pro-nuclear. And it's really his faction which is pretty much dictating the policy at the moment on everything to our useless Prime Minister Turnbull. He just gives into the right wing the whole time. Anyway, that's a side issue. The thing is, the Labor Party has an official policy against all nuclear development, and that's their official policy. And last year I sent emails individually to every Labor politician and everyone who would be a candidate in the next election, asking if they would stick to that policy. And quite a lot of them replied, we will definitely stay with that policy. And most of them just replied telling me what the policy is. I didn't really want that. I wanted to know what they thought themselves. So I think that I know that our leader of the opposition, Bill Shorten, would go along with nuclear power quite happily. He is okay, but he's a bit like our Prime Minister. He'll do whatever he thinks will get him into the job. So we have a few Labor politicians who genuinely are anti-nuclear, and we have quite a lot of others who would probably go along with it if they thought it was going to help them keep their seats. So Labor's pretty wishy-washy, but they still have the policy against nuclear development. Then another party is the Greens, which have had quite a lot of success for a little minor party, and they are totally opposed to nuclear power and very strong against it. And then we have a bunch of other little parties with various opinions. So we're not quite like you.
Yeah. guess a fourth party, but it's hard to call them a fourth party, would be we have a tiny Green Party here. And they do have an anti-nuclear platform, but they don't really count compared to the popularity of the other three parties, the Liberal, Conservative, and NDP. But they were actually infiltrated by a group of thoriumists/SMRs. And because of the structure of the Green Party, there was a real fear that they could vote for the policies, for pro-nuclear policies to be implemented in the Green Platform, because apparently that's how they organize their platform, is by voting on it within the party. So for a brief time, there was the idea that even the Green Party could be infiltrated with this sort of greenwashing of yet another form of nuclear.
That really doesn't surprise me
Yeah.
all that much. Given that you've told me what it's like in Canada, it would be harder for them to do that in Australia. But what is happening, when I mentioned the media before, I worry that the mainstream media is almost collapsing for lack of, well, they can't bring in the money anymore now that the internet, everyone's using Facebook and going to blogs and websites and things. But the new nuclear people, that's Michael Schellenberger and Ben Hurd and their friends, are really smart at setting up fake environment groups. And a good example of that is eco-modernism. If you read their charter, which is easy to find on the internet, you'll be amazed to find that it probably goes for about 4 pages. And nuclear will not be mentioned except for a little paragraph near the bottom of the 4th page. It is all lovely, touchy-feely stuff about the environment. And it's no surprise to find that heaps of environmentalists have actually joined eco-modernism because it all sounds so lovely.
Sure.
And that's a very good soft sell pro-nuclear group. And then there's groups like Environmental Progress, which also pretends to be environmental. And they actually went to the latest Paris climate conference and lobbied strongly for nuclear power as a solution to climate change. And there's lots of those groups with those sorts of names. I think it might be Mothers for Climate or, Nuclear for Climate, this women's group in that. And they put it across in such a lovely way that you think you're doing something really clean and green if you were to join them.
Yeah.
And I think they're a step ahead of the old nuclear industry, which really has no idea.
I like the term greenwashing. It really explains it.
That's what they do,
Yeah.
yes. But I just look at some of the stuff they write, and they'll put up these beautiful stories about all sorts of lovely left-wing causes like gay marriage and all the sorts of things that will appeal to real lefties. But underneath it all, the campaign is to develop nuclear power.
Yeah. And, and I think that the pro-nuclear, I just noticed today, I think Bulletin of the Atomic was promoting a podcast, and some other pro-nuclear earlier today was promoting yet another podcast. So I think there's a bunch of pro-nuclear podcasts, for example. So there's no end to their resourcefulness with their nuclear cafes and their, and they've got money behind them. And the anti-nuclear...
Unlike the old nuclear industry, which is struggling to get public acceptance around the world, the new nuclear people they're very smart with technology. They're good at making YouTubes and podcasts, and if you look up thorium, you'll see on YouTube, you'll see heaps of beautiful little videos that tell you how great thorium is. And I don't think, certainly in Australia, the anti-nuclear movement tries here, but I don't think we're nearly as cluey or as well funded to be able to do these sorts of promotions the way the new nuclear lobby can do.
Yeah. Probably good that somebody keeps at them.
I want to keep at them.
Yeah.
Now, I suppose I do some of this sort of intuitively.
Yeah.
But the fact that their propaganda is so modern and so good, I got to hand it to them.
Some links you'd like to promote, and I do have them here. Antinuclear.net and nuclearnews.net also have a blog on WordPress.
Yes, well, I've got a couple of those, but look, one is, I think it's nuclear.information at WordPress or something like that.
Yeah.
That's, I just set that up for myself.
Okay.
That's where I store articles that I think are really worth knowing about, going to for reference.
Okay.
Because most of the stuff that goes up on, or a lot of the stuff that I put up on nuclear news and on anti-nuclear, is topical, interesting today, gone tomorrow sort of stuff. So things that I want to be able to go back and refer to, I also put them up on Nuclear Information. And some people like that website because of the fact that it doesn't include all the latest little bits of news. It's got sort of more reference material.
Great. And that's a problem because in our short news cycle, we have the mental sort of retention of a small soap dish that seems to last about half a day. And so that's often why sometimes I'll wait a few days to re-promote an article, because I know by the time a few days go by, everybody's moved on.
Yes, that's right. I got influenced recently by just reading an interview with a man called Harold Evans, who is an elderly guy from Britain, a very long-term editor, interesting man, and about his new book, which is called Do I Make Myself Clear? That's the name of his book. And his book is about writing clearly. But he makes the point, if you've got a message, he said, you just have to keep on repeating it. People won't pay attention. Now read it once and forget it.
I think I heard in school that you have to repeat something 21 times for a student to retain it.
Oh, is that so?
Yeah.
Well, it's not a new idea, but I thought it was an important idea, so that's why on Nuclear News we just keep putting up stories, even if they are a repeat story about the Great Lakes, for example. That needs to just keep on reminding people.
A big influence, not just in Australia, Dr. Helen Caldicott.
Because she's the greatest, and she's a tiny little person and as soft as a kitten.
She is a titan, and she's terrifying. She is terrifying. What are you talking about?
She is not terrifying, you wimp.
To me, she is the queen, period. She is the top of the heap, so I felt very lucky to have her on the show.
Well, I think she's tops too. I think she's the greatest.
Oh, okay. Terrifying. So, one last thing I wanted to ask you about. I don't know where I heard this, but were you arrested?
I beg your pardon?
You were involved with some kind of protest against French atmospheric testing.
Well,
is that right?
Dr. Caldicott started the campaign, and a lot of other people got going on it. But I did a pretty crazy thing. Dr. Caldicott didn't tell me to do this. I just did it off my own bat, and it was mad. I went to a shopping centre, and everyone was celebrating France's bicentenary, I think, of the French Revolution or something. It was 1989. And I got a big fat texter, and I wrote ban the bomb and stuff like that all over their exhibits for recommending France. And of course I got myself arrested and went to court. And thank goodness a very good lawyer came to my aid and somehow or other got me off, and I didn't go to jail.
Wow.
But, it was a pretty mad thing to do.
Sure.
But that's what I did.
Wow.
Anyway, so that was as near as I got to jail, thank goodness.
So you are a hardcore activist.
Yes, I was a hardcore activist, but Caldicott didn't tell me to do anything.
No.
I just did it off my own bat.
That was Christina Macpherson. Find her online, www.antinuclear.net. Follow her on Twitter, @ChristinaMac1. She joined us from Melbourne, Australia by phone.
I'm Dave Archer in Toronto, Ontario.
And I'm Christina Macpherson in Melbourne, Australia.